Okay, so let's talk about Santa Rae 1000. So Santa Rae is not a new film by any means. It is just new old stock rebranded surveillance film. It's an ISO 1000 speed film, so it's great for nights, low lights, indoors, that kind of thing. And basically it's just been recut from what it was purposed for 35mm and 120. It's funny because when I actually opened up the 120 roll that I got, I still have a 35mm roll that we'll talk about later and kind of some things I want to try with that. But it was actually wrapped in Portra 400 paper. See if it's any good though. Alright, so I got 2 shots. So I shot this at night with the RB67. Again, I've been using that a lot lately just because it is just easier and I'm pretty comfortable using that for testing out rolls and things like this. So we use that downtown. After I shot the whole roll, I thought about it a little bit and I probably should have exposed it an extra stop just to make sure. And so of course I could have then pushed it in post in developing it, but I didn't want to do that. I kind of wanted to develop it at box speed just to see what it is right out of the gate without kind of messing it and maybe adding grain or just kind of putting it in a situation it's not what it meant for, especially since it's a much more sensitive film, being an ISO 1000 compared to, 400 or something like that. So it's kind of advertised as a high contrast film. In my opinion, I haven't shot a whole bunch of low light films. I've shot an Ilford, I think 3200 with a Nikon F3 and a couple other low light scenarios. But as far as that kind of a film stock, I don't have as much experience with that. I mean, I've seen more from shooting like a JCH 400 or some FOMO pans and things like that. Of course, those are ISO 400 speeds, 200s and things like that. So it's a little bit of a different comparison. I won't say the contrast was bad by any means, but I won't say it's as punchy and as poppy as I won't say it has as big of a punch as some other films I've shot for sure. I will say it's a very even exposure and contrast, and it gives you a lot of room to work with, especially in post, especially if you look at their examples as well, shooting in broad daylight or indoors and things like that, you have a pretty nice even exposure. Your shadows are great, there's still detail in them, but they're not so dark that you can't pull anything out of them. Same with the highlights, it's a nice, even, smooth contrast, which gives you a lot of play if you end up wanting to crank those shadows down or your blacks down, as well as your highlights. You can always bump those up as well as your whites to give you more of that contrast, to make it more closer to something like you would with a FOMO pan or something. That light.
Just take a photo.
So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a high contrast film. Of course, shooting in black and white and at night, it's gonna naturally be more contrasty, but I didn't see that punch that I would expect when comparing it to some other films that I think are very high contrast black and white films. Maybe. Double check this again. So there really isn't anything about this film that just kind of wowed me. Of course, there's really nothing about the images that wowed me either. But then I've got to think about it and, what exactly am I expecting to be wowed by? I feel like it's a very clean, usable film for low light, night photography, things like that. Indoors especially, you know, there's a lot of times where I'm shooting indoors and a 400 speed film just doesn't cut it. So having a black and white 1000 is gonna give you a lot more flexibility. You can shoot at a higher shutter speed and a lower f-stop to get those, you know, nice, smooth family portraits and things like that, or just any kind of indoor shots you want. This could be a great fit for that. I will say what I did notice after spending some more time looking at my negatives is that it wasn't super grainy and it wasn't a high, intense, very big grained film compared to something like a T-Max or a Tri-X film that I'm used to shooting, where there is a lot more grain introduced. I guess more so with expired films and things like that. But this, I would kind of compare it, I guess, to like an Ilford. It's got a very nice smooth grain, but it being at ISO 1000, it's even more appealing, because usually, of course, when you get to this higher and higher speeds, you introduce a lot more grain. Now remember, this was a medium format roll, it's not a 35 mil, so blowing it up, you know, grain is going to be a little bit different on a smaller negative compared to a big negative. But even if I zoom in on these negatives, I won't say that there's a lot of intense grain that makes it almost distracting or unappealing. That was something I kind of picked up on later. I thought it was very smooth given that high sensitivity film.
Probably the latter.
See. So to wrap up, after getting over my initially unimpressed feelings about this film, and actually looking at the film and not so much, you know, what I was able to capture with it or anything spectacular image-wise, when it comes to specifically the film, having a 1000 speed film with the low amount of grain that it has and a nice balanced even exposure across your highlights and shadows, especially given these night shots where, you know, you're going to have a huge contrast level between highlights and darks, still retaining that information so you can decide in post if you want to bring back a little bit of those shadows or drop those highlights and not lose any of that information, or you can go the other way and really create that contrast and still maintain that low grain amount. I think this is a great film if you're looking for something with a little higher speed. Of course, there are other options. I mean, Ilford has a 3200 speed film, I think, and there's a few other ones. And of course, you can push things like Portra to a decent amount if you're looking for something in color. But if you want to try a new black and white film that's kind of been repurposed and reused and give it new life in a different format, the Santa Rae 1000, I think, is a great option. I think with the roll of 35 mil that I still have, I'm gonna play around a little bit with exposures and kind of see what this film is capable of outside the strict box speed of 1000. So I may underexpose some by a stop or two, and then I may overexpose some by a stop or two, just to kind of see how much I can get out of that range as far as, you know, information and detail and things like that. I would like to push it a little bit and see, but I might order another box or two to do that with, just to see what happens if I push it to, you know, 1200, if I push it to 2 stops, 3 stops, things like that, how much grain I introduce and how much information I'm able to keep and kind of play with in that range. So those are my thoughts on Santa Rae 1000. If you have any questions, leave those in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. If there's any other films you would like me to do a little recap on, leave that in the comments. Why not? We got nothing else to do. But that is gonna wrap up this video on Santa Rae 1000.